From OECD perspective, we were talking about acronyms of RBC, etc., but you'll be helping us navigate through the horizons. So let's start with you. What is responsible business conduct? In short, RBC. And what's the relevance of the guidelines and their most recent updates?
What it has in common with all these terms, like ESG, like CSR, is that it's really about businesses paying attention to more than just their financial bottom line. But it is a little bit more specific because it says that all companies, no matter whether large or small, who they're owned by, where they're based, how they're incorporated, all companies should pay attention to their impacts. On the one hand, the negative impacts, so adverse impacts as we call them, that they might have on people and the planet, but also make a positive contribution to sustainable development. It applies for all companies. And then it's also about their supply chain. So we're not just talking about their own operations, we're not just talking about immediate suppliers, but we're thinking about businesses looking through their supply chain and thinking about what the impact is there and really trying to improve it.
OECD has been providing us the most comprehensive guidelines, which is also, in a way, created the foundation for EU's or other countries' related legislations as well. So it's an important part, and OECD has been a great help. And the companies who have already been into your guidelines and the standards are easily adapting to the new versions of the legislation that are coming up in different countries. But we see there's a shift to the mandatory side in areas. But here I want to go to Thierry for his structure, because Denmark has been creating a very interesting arena and platform for this area, because they've been quite successful, but until now, in the absence of hard legislation, your companies has been thriving with this area. So this is an important part. So what has led the business community in Denmark, in your opinion, to implement the aspects of different ESG structures and become the front runners? Please enlighten us.
Thank you, Eray Bey, and thank you for the invitation, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I feel honored because I'm probably the least qualified person in the room to be talking about ESG or RBC, but thank you very much. I'm happy to give you a layman's sort of perspective on it from Denmark, and as you were saying yourself, this is not an area where we have had we have seen hard legislation introduced in Denmark, unlike what you might expect, because Denmark is, I think, widely considered sort of a front runner when it comes to sustainability, and Danish companies often feature sort of prominently on lists of sustainability. So what is it that has driven them to take on these considerations? Well, again, these are just my views, but generally speaking, I think in Denmark there is very overall, but there's a culture of sustainability that goes back decades that has really seeped into society and also seeped into to companies. So that's sort of a very general backdrop. We see companies also, when you think of the Danish business community, you typically think of companies within renewables, within water treatment, you know, a lot to deal with the issues we're talking about here. And Danish companies have, I think, because of this history of this culture of sustainability, often seen this less as a challenge and more as a platform for innovation. So Danish companies have taken it on board and innovated on the basis of sustainability considerations. Then Danish companies are typically SMEs, and they're fairly small, so they're part of ecosystems, and they cannot go out into the world and do things on their own. So there's a lot of dissemination of information. They inspire one another when they work together. They're typically very dependent on one another. So one company takes on considerations or starts evolving and is successful doing it, and it will inspire others to follow suit. You have to remember Denmark is a small and very open economy, so a very, very large proportion of the business community is very internationalized. So they're also very open and see what's going on in the world, are inspired. So they would typically also see where things are more advanced, where legislation is coming into place, or where there's a demand, etc. So that will affect them clearly. I will come back to it maybe a little bit later, but there's also a tradition in Denmark of public-private collaboration that you don't see many places. And I can give some concrete example later on. But that has also, that combined with a political culture in Denmark that is very, it's collaborative, and you see it's based on compromise. So even if we have changing governments, everything is based on political parties working together. So issues like the welfare state, issues like sustainability, for instance, will typically not change over time. There might be they will tweak things, but the overall tendency that sustainability, for instance, is hugely important and something we favor in Denmark will never change. So companies also, it's easier for them to take it on and to comply with it because they're not waiting for the next elections. They know that this will not go away. And then one final thing that is maybe unique to Denmark, or maybe not unique, but quite unique in Northern Europe, is that we have something called enterprise foundations. Enterprise foundations, as the name suggests, are foundations that wholly or control companies, if you will. Many of the largest Danish companies are foundations. We're talking Carlsberg, Lego, Maersk, Novo Nordisk, companies you might know. They're actually controlled by foundations that have philanthropic purposes, ultimately. So that will also affect the way a business is run. Of course, they still run like businesses, and they still have to profit maximize, but they do it with certain values and certain societal view, and so that will seep into it. And this, to give you an extent of how much this is part of the Danish economy, I think about a third of Danish exports is actually done by companies that are foundations. So it is a huge part of the economy and really is a factor, if you will. So these are some of the things that I would say has been driving this rather than legislation, really. But obviously, Danish companies are just as confused as to the new rules that are coming as many others, because while they might be more prepared in some ways and adapted to this way of working, they're still not used to have to comply with. They've been cherry-picking maybe the parts that they wanted, rather than having to live up to sort of a standardized rules set that is established by someone else. So still, it will be a challenge.
If one company tries to do something and the others don't, then it won't pay off. Obviously, everybody has to have some profit and the style, and the rules are structured. So it's like a value chain transforming itself voluntarily. But on the other side, it's a weird, as I mentioned, history in time, because we'll be expecting to see the transposition of CSRD, CSDDD, green claims directives, etc., all into your national obligatory rule structure as well.
From voluntary to mandatory. I mean, this is really a transition stage, if I should say so, for responsible business issues. Now there are more and more binding rules, like international directives, acts, etc., that the international players are expecting from you. I mean, by the maybe force of law, you have to adopt these rules. So when we talk about binding regulations, there are like maybe two main concepts I have to stress. One of them is sustainability, and the other one is global value chains or supply chains. Higher standards for them to obey, and this is not only for the companies themselves. I mean, they are now responsible from their supply chains, from their value chains as well. That they don't have the luxury to say, oh, I don't know what was happening with my supplier, etc.
France already implemented jail time, imprisonment for people who are unable to report correctly under CSRD. The other countries might take different approaches, but Germany has already created movement on the value chain.
And then one thing that kind of follows from this is really prioritization. So in the context of the company, it's important to think about what are the issues that are most relevant, the risks that are most pressing, most likely, and the ones that we can do something about and should be doing something about. So prioritization.
Independent from what we call it, how we abbreviate it, ethics and responsibility will be in the core of our way of doing business.